My third gen Tacoma is at 60,000 miles, which means that it is due for some maintenance. Specifically, what I'm tackling today is going to be the differential, front and rear differential, since I have four-wheel drive, and the transfer case fluid exchanges. Now, there's plenty of videos on YouTube that kind of detail how to do that, but as I was researching and trying to familiarize myself with this process, it seemed like they all kind of glossed over a few things that were maybe a little bit more nuanced. So I wanted to give a little bit more contextual information about how to do this. Now, starting off, the first question is going to be, what fluid do you want to use? And you need to consult your owner's manual. So in mine, it says for both the front and the rear differential, they use the same differential fluid, which is spec'd out as a 75W85 GL5 gear oil. The transfer case is spec'd out as a 75 weight, just straight 75, not a multi-grade oil, and that is a GL4 fluid. So first of all, if you're not that familiar with oils, that's a lot to digest to understand what all that means. So GL is a different type of classification that kind of dictate what type of extreme pressure oil additives are in that oil mixture. GL5 is the most extreme oil package that you can get, and it's great for differentials where you have extreme pressure, especially at that pinion gear where it engages the ring. Gearboxes in the differential they're big brutes of a gearbox. They need a thick, tough oil with lots of high pressure additives in there. The other thing is additives in a GL5 fluid can sometimes have negative reactions with yellow metals. So looking at like brass, and yellow metals are commonly used in synchronizers, which are in manual transmissions and also in transfer cases. So if you're not as familiar with the nuances of oil weights are just describing the viscosity or the thickness. So whether this fluid flows like pancake syrup or like water. Common oils you see are going to be in multi-weight oil, where it'll be like a 10W30 engine oil, or in this case a 75W85 differential oil. And that just means the first number is how it behaves when it's cold. So the W actually stands for winter. So a 75-85 oil flows like a cold 75 weight oil when that fluid is cold, but once it warms up, it flows like a hot 85 weight oil. So all oil will thin as it gets hot. So the way you can think of it, because it might be odd that you think, hey, 85 is a bigger number, so is it getting thicker at hotter temperatures? No, what it's doing is it's still thinning, but it's just not thinning as much as a straight 75 oil. So based on how it's spec'd in the owner's manual, that is basically the difference, is that the straight 75 weight oil, when it gets hot in the transfer case, will thin out more than the differential fluid. So the next logical follow-up question is going to be, can you deviate from your owner's manual? And the answer is, of course. It's your truck. You can do whatever you want. You can read for hours on the internet and you won't likely come to any type of consensus, but the argument typically stems from a couple different directions. One, Toyota engineers knew exactly what they were doing, and they designed this exact specific gearbox for this exact specific oil, and if you deviate, bad things will happen. The second camp is going to be like, well, I've ran this fluid in here even though it doesn't match the owner's manual forever and nothing's bad happened. Or the Gen 2 Tacoma has a similar, say, transfer case, and I ran 75W90 in it and nothing happened, so what's different about this transfer case? The other argument that is also brought up commonly is that these same trucks are sold all over the globe, and there are different oil specs in different regions of the world. So if you go to, say, an Australia owner's manual, they might spec out a 7590 instead of a straight 75 weight oil for the transfer case. Why is the American owner's manual different if mechanically it's kind of the same? And of course, there's different regulations that impact different areas of the globe, and so that goes back to the whole fuel economy argument. And it's really just kind of a circular argument. I will mention too that I know from my experience in automotive engineering, the factory fill fluids are not always what is quote unquote best for the absolute best gear life. It's a lot of different factors based on who their bulk oil supplier is, how many different vehicles or engine and gearbox combinations come down that assembly line. And also when you're building a vehicle, you don't necessarily know if it's being sold somewhere in Texas versus Massachusetts versus New York versus Arizona and so on. So a lot of times you might spec out a generically good fluid that works in a wide operating range just to kind of cover all your bases, so to speak. So I did decide that I will deviate on the differentials, and I'm going to use a 75W90 synthetic gear oil. This is Mobile 1, and it's very close to 75W85 gear oil, so it's not really that different. Another thing to consider, the 90 weight on the second number, that does mean that it won't quite thin out as much as a 75W85 oil. But that being said, it's still going to be thinner than the oil when it's cold. So the gears are not seeing a viscosity that it's never seen before, if that makes sense. So for the transfer case, I am following the spec as far as it's going to be a straight 75 weight oil, GL4 fluid. I know some people use the 75 W90 gear oil in their transfer case with no ill effects, but the thicker oil, some people have periodically complained about shifting ability as far as it not shifting, maybe the oil's too thick. So I'm using liquid moly for my 75 weight oil, but it's also available from Redline and Revinol and presumably other manufacturers. This GL4 75 weight fluid is more in line with the manual transmission fluid than it is an actual gearbox oil. So now that you've learned more about transfer case and gearbox fluids than you possibly ever would have wanted to know, the next thing is, as well, logistically, how do you put the fluid into the differential? Engine oil changes are easy. You pop the hood and you can just use a funnel, pour it in from the top straight from the container. Gearboxes that are underneath the vehicle are a little bit more difficult because you can't just go on top of the gearbox. Usually the fill port's on the side, so you need some type of pumping mechanism. This Mobile One does come in a pointy top container. It's a little squeeze bottle, so you can kind of hold it sideways and squeeze it in. That can get tedious. I know Valvoline also makes it that comes in almost like a Capri Sun pouch, so that way it's very flexible and you can kind of make it fit in by the sides of the gearboxes without having to point it completely upside down or anything like that. They also make different types of fluid pumps. Like if you're working at an actual mechanic shop, you probably just have a bulk oil drum and it's got some type of pneumatic actuated pump where you can just press a button and it squirts the fluid out of it. If you're doing it from a home situation, then it's a little bit more difficult. They do make pump top type fluid oil pumps. You can get them at Harbor Freight for like $10. They're designed to kind of screw onto the top of a typical oil container. So think of like a large shampoo bottle that has a pump top. That being said, I just thought that would be tedious in cramped quarters, pumping the top. It has a little hose that you stick up into the side port of it, and I just thought that would get really tedious really quick. Your forearm would be pulsing by the time you did all three of these. So I didn't really want to do that, but that is an option as well. So if you have an air compressor, you can even homebrew a type of oil pump, which is what I did. Yes, this is just a plastic container that came from some cold brew coffee that I bought at the grocery store. I have two fittings in the top of this. One is just a tire valve stem, a Schrader valve. This is one that I bought on Amazon, and it is a bolt-in. So you drill a hole, it has a rubber gasket underneath it, and it's got a little coupling nut that tightens it down. That way I can hook an air compressor tire inflator directly into it, and I can pressurize this bottle. The next fitting is just a kind of brass 1/4 inch nipple fitting. This is a bulkhead fitting is what it's called, and that's because there's kind of a barbed fitting on the bottom side and on the top side. So this just allows me to have this tube connected to it, and it passes through straight to the bottom. So when you have that long straw and you put the lid on, that long straw is going to be at the bottom. You can put air through the valve stem, that'll pressurize it, but the air is coming in through the top, which is going to want to push the oil downwards. When it pushes it downwards, the oil is incompressible. You can't compress it like you can air, and that's going to force it to go up the tube that's inside, and it will force it out this tube. So my goal is to kind of use my air compressor with my tire inflator. I do have a shutoff valve here, so once it's filled, if it's still residual air pressure in the lines, I can turn it to shut off the oil flow. But my thought is I can put 1.5 quarts of oil in here at a time. I can hold my tire inflator in one hand, and I can just hold the other end of the tube into the gearbox, give it a shot of air, make sure I'm not over pressurizing it to where it's building pressure in the plastic container. You only need like 5 psi to really start pushing the oil. And this is the tool that I'm going to be using today.